I guess my main job is to just do a very brief bit of housekeeping and then to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Mic Mayhew. I'd assumed, I have to say, that because he's a doctor and he's from the University of Cumbria, that meant, well, I asked him earlier on what his PhD was in, but it actually turns out that Mick is an ex-vet, which I think is a particularly interesting backstory. Yeah, Mick's been a practicing vet for all his adult life in Cumbria, had a practice in North Cumbria before switching through an interest in, I guess, more the sort of the scientific side of zoology. Has been teaching at the University of Cumbria and is now involved in the Back on Our Map project. So he's obviously here to talk about pine martens, both the sort of the ecological side, so we can all find out a little bit more about them, and then we'll be saying, telling us more about some of the studies that have been going on about the feasibility for reintroductions, or I think we have to use the language of reinforcement, don't we? I think technically, because there are very, very occasional records that sometimes come in for Cumbria. So really looking forward to that. So welcome everyone, and Mick, over to you. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thanks for that lovely introduction, Tom, and welcome everyone. I'm kind of surprised you're not all out enjoying the best that spring has to offer, but impressed that you have chosen to stay in and listen to a presentation about pesky pine martens. So before I start, I'd just like to thank Anya and Michelle and Sarah and Claire and the team at Morecambe Bay Partnership for hosting and organising this evening. So before I start, I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that I'm not working on my own. There's a little team of dedicated pine marten workers. Ellie Kent, one of the project officers who I work with at Boom, and Dr. Andy Jennings and Dr. Chris Brooks, who work largely in a voluntary capacity, who have been extremely useful on the mapping and modelling side. Ellie has helped me a great deal with the community engagement. So I don't think any of my pals on the pine marten team are here this evening, but I wanted just to acknowledge their input. This evening, I think what I'd like to introduce is this feasibility study that I've been involved with through the Boom project that started in September 2019. And I want to put it to you that the big question here is to try and establish if indeed a reintroduction or reinforcement, I'm not going to get too bogged down in technicalities, if indeed a reintroduction of pine martens is the correct way or is the right approach to restore this species to Cumbria or not. And what I'll do is I'll present some of the work that we have been involved with over the last 2 or 3 years, and then we can talk about, to some extent, you can make your own judgment based on the evidence at the end of the talk. Okay, so we'll look briefly at the ecology and biology of this mustelid, this member of the weasel family. We'll talk about the conservation status. I'll mention the aims of the Boom feasibility project. And then I'd like to present some of the results, because we're quite far down the line. We're actually in the process now of writing up this feasibility report, and we're considering sort of next steps towards implementation, whether we should or shouldn't. So we'll look at results from modelling, fieldwork, some of the engagement with local communities, and then think about next steps. For those of you who don't know, I'm not going to go into any detail at all, because this is not a kind of general Boom presentation, but Boom is a 4-year lottery-funded, community-based project that aims to restore threatened and locally extinct native species of plants and animals to quite a large chunk of South Cumbria. So that's the sort of essence of the project in 1 or 2 lines. It's administered by the university, but it's in partnership with CWT, Natural England, Forestry England, and of course friends from Morecambe Bay Partnership. So let's delve into the wonderful world of pine martens and just think a little bit about ecology, reproductive biology, and so on. So for those of you who don't know too much about martens, they're a member of the mustelid, stoat and weasel family, family Mustelidae. And they're very much the most arboreal of the mustelids that we have in this country. In other words, they're fantastic at climbing trees, and they're really well adapted in terms of their structure and anatomy for that purpose. So they have longer legs than stoats and weasels. They have very powerful lower limb muscles. They have a long, sleek body with a brush-like tail, much like something akin to what you might see on a primate. And they'll use that long tail as a counterbalance as they're sort of leaping around in the canopy. They have low reproductive rates, quite different to stoats and weasels. So the females come into season, come into estrus after the kits are weaned in the summertime, and then she is mated, and after a period of delayed implantation, she will give birth to usually no more than 2 or 3 kits in the following year, in the following April, about now, when she's 3 years of age. They only breed once a year, so they have a relatively low breeding output, if you like, or potential for breeding. They're also very territorial. The males and females hold territories of different sizes, but they can be quite large, dependent on habitat. So the combination of those low reproductive rates and their sort of territoriality means that they're never very thick on the ground, pine martens, even in optimum habitat. And just before we move on, if you have a look at that wonderful skull there in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see that clearly these animals are carnivores. They've got the canine teeth to kill prey with at the front of their mouths, and then they've got the premolars to hold prey, and these large carnassials or molars at the back of the mouth used to shear meat. So very much the impression of a small carnivore, but as we'll discover, they have more omnivorous habits in terms of what they eat, and they consume a whole variety of other prey, including meat. Okay, so here's a little quiz for you. I'd like you to tell me the odd one out from this little video clip. These are all being stitched together from camera trap images, most of which are from our study site in the south of Cumbria. Okay, so I hear you shouting, does he think I'm stupid? I know it's fairly obvious that all of those critters in the video are mustelids, native mustelids, native to the UK, except of course for the red fox. But the other thing to point out there is that the stoat, the polecat, the otter, the badger were all taken on our own camera traps in the Rusland Valley and Grisdale area of South Cumbria, where of course the pine marten, this lovely pine marten footage of a female pulling a well-grown kit out of a den box was generously given to me by John Marten, the county mammal recorder. And this was one of John's camera traps, I think, from the Galloway Forest Park. So there are some pictures of martens. And for those of you who wondered what this strange PVC pipe contraption was, we call that a tea sniffer. And that horizontal tube at the top is a bait tube in which we squash sardines and eggs and all sorts of unsavory baits to lure the martens and any other creatures towards the camera trap. And the idea is that the design of that tea sniffer is such that if a marten approached it, it would have to jump up on its back legs and reveal its bib to the camera. And the bib is the unique identifier in that species that tells us, that allows us to differentiate between individual males and females in the landscape. So what do they eat? Well, we talked a little bit about it. This picture clearly shows a marten chasing a red squirrel through the treetops. And of course, they do consume a very small proportion of their diet consists of red squirrels, a species they've co-evolved with, but actually they're opportunistic omnivores and they're generalists. So they will eat whatever is in season, if you like, whatever's seasonally abundant. And that includes plant and animal-based foods. So their preference is for small mammals. In fact, even within that category, they prefer field voles above all else. And small mammals comprise perhaps 40% of their diet through all the seasons. But actually in the springtime, they'll take a few bird nestlings and eggs. In the summer, they consume lots of invertebrates. They have a real penchant for beetles. Then through into the autumn time, they'll take fruit, rowan berries, blackberries, bilberries, and in the winter, they'll take carrion. So really whatever is seasonally abundant and relatively easy to catch, they'll take it. And here's a kind of smorgasbord of pine marten scats. So I collected these in a couple of hours around on a peninsula called Applecross on the west coast of the Highlands last year. And they're relatively easy to find. If pine martens are in the area, they tend to leave these scats or pine marten poos along linear features, so stone walls, paths, stream banks, that type of thing. And even without any clever science, any DNA work or microscopes, you can just look at those scats and get a really good impression of what they're feeding on. So I don't know if you can see my pointer, but I'm going to attempt to show you. This scat here is full of blackberry pips. This one here has cherry stones in it. This one here, if you looked up close, you'd see that it had sort of blue-black glistening material in it, and those are the elytra or the wing cases of beetles. And bizarrely, this one that looks as if it's been consuming carrots, that's the result of pine marten predating wasp and bee hives or nests. So they eat the honey and some of the wax and the grubs, and they end up with this very fluorescent orange scat. So let's talk about squirrels, because it's an important and quite an emotive subject in our part of the world. There's been a lot of work done unraveling the population dynamics, the interactions between pine martens and red and grey squirrels, where those three species coexist in the landscape. A lot of that work was done by Emma Sheehy for her PhD, and then in some work she did after her PhD, Josh Twining from Belfast, from Queen's in Belfast. But the long and short of it is, quite well displayed in these two little figures. So if we start, essentially what we're looking at here is the All Ireland Pine Marten survey that was conducted in 2007 at the top, and comparing it with that 2019 at the bottom. And for various reasons, predominantly because of habitat restoration and lower levels of persecution, pine martens have really recolonized pine martens have recolonized every county actually now in the Republic of Ireland. Their populations have grown substantially over the last couple of decades. And the result of that is that back in 2007, there was a great big gap, almost a complete absence of red squirrels in the counties of the Irish Midlands. And if you look at the map at the bottom, you'll see that actually as a result, or at least there's a correlation between the increase in abundance of martens over those 12 years and the fact that red squirrels have recolonized those counties in the Midlands. If we look at the same time period impacts on grey squirrels, you'll see that grey squirrels were abundant in those Midland counties in 2007, and now they've been pushed back towards the coast. And that sort of interaction has been demonstrated in Scotland as well. And there are all sorts of theories as to why it happens, but it seems that pine martens are better at gobbling up grey squirrels than red squirrels. And current thoughts relate to the fact that red squirrels have co-evolved with pine martens, so they have predator avoidance strategies, whereas these larger ignorant grey squirrels that have never really shared a range, a geographic range with a pine marten, just don't have the same ability to escape. And so the end result is that increasing pine marten populations usually result in a rebound in red squirrel numbers at the expense of greys. Right, let's talk a little bit about distribution. So martens were persecuted, well, marten populations collapsed over the last sort of couple of centuries. They reached a sort of low point towards the end of the 19th century as a result of habitat loss, but predominantly as a result of persecution by man, by members of the rural community. And then in the first half of the 20th century, their populations rebounded pretty well north of the border, but they remain critically endangered south of the border in England and Wales. And their numbers have not recovered in the same way south of the border as they have in Scotland. This situation is changing very rapidly. We'll talk in a little bit about existing reintroductions in the Forest of Dean and in mid Wales to try and re-establish martens in those parts of the UK. In Cumbria, just out of interest, although we've had, since the project started, probably a dozen unconfirmed reports from members of the public regarding pine martens, actually the last confirmed record was from 2010, and that was a scat that was found at Satterthwaite. So in terms of national conservation efforts to date, south of the border, between 2015 and 17, there was a reinforcement of pine martens in Wales, and strictly a reinforcement because there was still a small breeding population in Wales. 51 martens were reintroduced over 2 years. They're doing really well, and they're beginning to spread, and they're breeding and so forth. More recently in 2019 and again in 2021, I think they had to miss a year because of COVID. Martens have also been reintroduced to the Forest of Dean. And the idea is that those two populations are close enough to each other to allow dispersal and to enable connectivity, what we call a meta population. And they can, and that in so doing, they can establish gene flow and movement between the populations and help to repopulate that part of the country with martens. So let's think now about the Boom feasibility study and look first at the aims. Why are we doing this project? Well, the aim really was to use the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, reintroduction guidelines as a framework to evaluate if reintroduction is the best strategy to recover viable, self-sustaining pine marten populations in South Cumbria or not. And of course, there's an option here. And many people, there are many individuals, members of the public, stakeholder groups that we're working with who understand the process of reintroduction, but actually they would prefer nature to take its course. And pine martens have recolonized the north of Cumbria, parts of Northumberland, the sort of greater Kielder area. And there are folks who would like those martens to be left to recolonize forest areas in South Cumbria in their own time, instead of costly, high-risk, complex reintroduction projects. So the IUCN, I'm not going to go into any detail here because it's probably too technical, but the IUCN framework, this international framework, has been around since 2013, and it's a really comprehensive sort of checklist for anyone involved in reintroduction projects. And really that checklist involves all aspects of the project, from the very first concepts, the aims, the objectives, the goals of the project, the funding that's required, whether in fact you should use reintroduction or recolonization, all of the ecological and social aspects of the feasibility work that you need to do, right through until the implementation of the reintroduction or the translocation, the movement of animals. And even beyond that, there is guidance in terms of how you monitor populations post-release, how you monitor those animals that you've taken from donor populations and released at a recipient site. So the success of reintroduction projects all around the world has increased very substantially since people have started referring or designing their projects in alignment with the IUCN reintroduction guidelines. Most importantly, it also asks the question, have the factors that resulted in extinction been overcome? And that's really crucial. You know, pine marten in Cumbria were not rendered extinct. Now we'll talk about that in a moment. Because of habitat loss, they were rendered, they were reduced in number essentially because of persecution. So if you're involved in a reintroduction project, there is no point at all in progressing if the communities you're working with are all opposed to what you're doing and will inevitably continue to persecute the animals after they've been released. So very quickly, this is the Boom project area, except to say we're not doing anything with fish in Morecambe Bay, so that bit shouldn't be there. But essentially, we're working all the way from Barrow in Furness, Barrow slag banks, the small blue butterfly work that I think we touched upon, all the way to the Arnside and Silverdale AONB in the north, and in the east, and Grisdale Forest in the north. And the Marten work that we've been doing over the last 2.5 years is up there in the Roslyn Valley and Grisdale, sort of between Hawks Head in the north, Newby Bridge in the south, and the Two Lakes. That said, before I move on, we've extended that area now. We're working with some fantastic groups like John Hodgson and his team from Restoring Hard Knot Forest in the Duddon Valley, which is west of the area I've just talked to you about. So we're expanding that study area a little bit as we gain more capacity and as more people are involved. So let's move on and look at results. And a couple of years ago, I didn't know anything about modeling, but modeling is a really important, mapping and modeling is a really important part of a reintroduction project, because there are some key questions that modeling can help us to answer. So, for example, people have said to us, well, if you reintroduce or reinforce martens in South Cumbria, how large will the population grow? Will the population remain viable or will it dwindle to extinction? Is there connectivity between those marten populations in the south and those that have reached Northumberland and North Cumbria in the north, and so on? So there are all these kind of key questions that you need to know about to gauge the risk involved in any subsequent reintroduction, and some of those can be answered through modeling. By the way, all of this work, this good work that's been done, was done by Andy and Chris, who I mentioned at the beginning. So I'll just give them a nod again at this point. Where are the best places in Cumbria for pine martens? Well, what Andy did there was he used a technique called ecological niche modeling, which essentially uses the environmental characteristics of known occurrences to assess the suitability of other regions. In other words, he used a program called Maxent, and he took historical pine marten records, elevation data, and data about land cover types across the county. And he looked in detail at the characteristics of the landscape adjacent to all of those historic records to make predictions about where in the wider landscape that exists today where the best or most suitable habitat might be for pine martens. And this is the map that he came out with. And the intensity of color relates to habitat suitability. So you can see quite clearly the two most suitable habitats are this block in the north of Cumbria that I talked about before, North Cumbria adjacent to Northumberland, parts of Kielder Forest, and this rather large connected forest habitat network that we're working in the south. The flip side of that is that you can see the peaks of the Central Lakes are not terribly suitable. The grouse moors of the Pennines to the east and the north are also not terribly suitable. So that gives you an idea of where the best sites might be to think about a reintroduction. Andy then went on and looked at woodland connectivity, because we know from other studies that the best habitat for pine marten includes sort of upwards of 20% woodland cover, although they still do reasonably well in areas between 5 and 20% woodland cover. So they're sometimes known as woodland specialists. They actually do reasonably well in scrubby habitats. They use woodland edge habitats, but we wanted to essentially establish the best potential area to release these martens. And to do that, he designed a map of woodland connectivity. And again, you can see quite clearly that actually this, in terms of habitat in the south of the county, the area we're working on is by far the largest area of suitable habitat. And in terms of connected areas, really the connectivity is better to the west than it is to the east. So from Rusland into the Duddon Valley and Eskdale and Ennerdale and so forth. So it gives you an idea of those areas that that could be colonized by a reintroduced pine marten population over time. So the next thing that we were concerned about, and we tried to unravel using modeling, was whether pine martens that were translocated to South Cumbria, whether they would form a viable population. And to do this, Andy used a program called Vortex. And what he did, I mean, there are all sorts of scenarios that you can set up, but what he did was he took 40 pine martens, translocated them to South Cumbria, and then after a period of 20 years, he assumes that 4 animals, 2 males and 2 females, would reach those reintroduced populations in South Cumbria from the Kielder area in the north. And if you look at the graph, it's interesting because those reintroduced animals in isolation do reasonably well for a few years, but then the population starts to decline. There are all sorts of possible reasons for that. They're quite good at getting killed on roads. It may be that there just wasn't enough genetic diversity and they were inbreeding. Who knows? But the fact is that after 20 years, they weren't doing so well. But the introduction of some new genes and a few additional animals from the north allows that population to rebound and remain stable in the long term. So that answers a really important question about connectivity. Essentially, we've established that it's likely that if you reintroduce martens in isolation in South Cumbria, they're not going to do so well. But if there is some movement and some connectivity to populations in the north, they're likely to thrive. Chris then used a different modeling approach and looked at 3 scenarios. So no reintroduction in South Cumbria with 4 martens dispersing from the north, a reintroduction in South Cumbria with 20 martens in year 1 and year 2 in isolation, and a combination of the 2. And his results yielded a map that looks like that. So this is percent occupancy of martens over 200 years, over the long term. And what you can see there is that essentially occupied territories, viable populations in the long term establish themselves, as you'd expect, in that Kielder block further north and in the area we're working on at the moment. And most additional occupancy occurs in those connected forest habitats to the west rather than to the east. So it looks as if those little dormice are safe for a little bit longer. But it also tells us that although there are probably not viable breeding populations and permanently occupied territories between the northeast, between those strongholds in the north and the south, actually the landscape is porous, and that's key. So the modeling demonstrates that not all habitat is suitable, but they will disperse and there will be some level of movement from the north to the south to enable those animals that were reintroduced in the south to form a stable, viable breeding population in the long term. So that's long-winded and complex, and I apologize if that's not well understood. But and just finally, Chris did some work to establish whether Kielder pine martens will colonize South Cumbria. So this is the scenario without a reintroduction. The question is, how long will it take for martens to reach those forests in South Cumbria? And if indeed they do reach the forests, will they form a viable breeding population? What he did was he simulated this over 50 years using 20 replicates. And the blue bar that you see there is the length of time it takes for a marten to reach South Cumbria. And the red bar above it is the time that marten remains present within the area. And what you can see there is that in 2 out of 20 cases, martens don't reach South Cumbria at all. And in only 1 out of 20 cases, is there a viable breeding population at 50 years? So to summarize that, there's a 90% likelihood that martens will reach South Cumbria in 50 years, but only a 5% likelihood that they'll form a viable population. So, and that's quite a powerful bit of evidence in favor of translocation, reinforcement, reintroduction, whatever you want, because it suggests that left to their own devices, it will take several decades for these martens to reach their destination and reach a viable population. So that's it, the top field work. Let's move on and talk a little bit about the field work that we've done. Well, we had a network of 20 baited camera traps out over 2 years. We've looked at the data across one of those 2 years, and of 8,000 videos that were captured, we collected data on 45 different species, a number of red and amber listed species, birds like woodcock, mammals like red squirrels, foxes, which represent the greatest threat to, or the greatest predator of young pine martens, certainly are very widely distributed at 18 of the trap locations, as you might imagine. Polecats were interesting because polecats were also extremely rare. They were exposed to similar threats and risks to martens. Well, they're out there. They're thinly distributed. We only had 18 detections across 5 of our 20 camera sites, but that's quite a good omen. You know, if polecats share, there is niche overlap, at least to some extent, between martens and polecats. They're both mustelids. If the polecats can survive, I think it's a good omen for the martens, for any martens that were reintroduced. Key thing is that across 8,000 videos and a whole network of camera traps in Grisdale and Rusland, we had not a single detection of martens. Now, that doesn't mean they're not out there. So no, we can't say they're extinct. Of course we can't. It's impossible to confirm absence of an animal that's so elusive. But I think what we can say is that if they're out there, there is certainly not a viable breeding population, and they exist at an extremely low density. Over the last 2 or 3 years, I've walked hundreds of miles of transects looking for scats and not found any. We've spoken to all sorts of farmers and landowners living in the area, and although we've had these unconfirmed sightings, many of which I suspect are polecats, we've not had a single confirmed sighting in the time that we've been doing the project. Let's look specifically at camera traps and red-grey squirrels. This is what's known as a heat map. So again, the intensity of color around each of these numbers represents the abundance or the number of red squirrels on the left and grey squirrels on the right. And across the 20 traps, 8 of our traps detected red squirrels. 18 of them detected grey squirrels, and despite the valiant efforts of Bob Cartwright and the Westmoreland red squirrels, there's some great work going on. The reality is that the remaining red squirrels in Rusden and Grisdale are surrounded on all sides. And I suspect time is running out. But we don't know exactly it's very difficult to establish actual numbers of animals from pine marten data, but we do know that the detection ratio between reds and greys was 13:1. And of the 8,000 videos, something like 26% were grey squirrels and 2% were reds. In July and August, during the summer months last year, we did some woodland surveys, and you might ask, well, what's the point of woodland surveys if you've got some great mapping and modeling? But there's only so much that mapping and modeling can tell you, and actually you need to get your wellies on and get out into the woods to really study the microhabitat features, as we call them, of the woods to establish whether a woodland is suitable for martens or not. So there are certain characteristics of a woodland that enhance the survival of martens, and it's that we looked at. So we had 69, just shy of 70 circular plots. This is Tasmin from Hard Knot Forest Project, who was one of our great volunteers. And we went out and we assessed all sorts of vegetation variables, both within the tree or the canopy layer and on the floor in the field and ground layers. And I won't go into detail because this was a big chunk of work, but I'll just show you one or two of the results so you get a flavor of what we were trying to do. Diameter at breast height, DBH. This is something that's very familiar to foresters. It's a measure of the width of a tree trunk at 1.3 meters above sea level, above the ground, kind of nipple level, if you like. And why is that important? Well, it's important because female martens need arboreal denning sites to rear their kits. Okay, so they need cavities in large hollow trees that are well insulated, that are elevated out of the reach of foxes to ensure that they can successfully rear their young, their kits. And what we know is that the availability of these cavities is correlated with the width of deciduous trees, and oak is particularly important. And if you look at the oaks that we found in our study plots, you'll see that almost 50% of them had a DBH between 21 and 40 centimeters, which is still relatively small. Most of the cavities occur in oaks above 60 centimeters. And we only had 9% of our oaks above 60 centimeters. If you look across the 4 different habitat types that we studied and consider all of the 23 tree species that we found, actually the mean DBH across the whole lot is only 19 centimeters. So what does this tell us? Well, the habitat is still great for martens, but much of the forest in South Cumbria it consists of even-age stands that was planted at the same time, and it's young. So denning sites would be a problem if we reintroduced martens. And that's really useful to know, because at all sorts of other sites in the Highlands and in Dumfries and Galloway, they've installed den boxes to meet that need, that denning need, where cavities in these younger forests or conifer forests where cavities did not exist or weren't terribly numerous. And then just one more slide about the woodland plot surveys that we did. this stuff's important as well. You need to look down and you need to consider what's on the woodland floor. And we found, for example, and our results compare very favorably here with the studies, similar studies that were done in the Forest of Dean, where pine martens are now thriving. But 27% of ground cover was grass. And why is that important? Well, it's important because particularly that extensive tussocky grass, that longer stuff, is great habitat for small mammals. And small mammals are the most important prey item for pine martens. But look down here, 6% bilberry cover, 6% bramble cover. So over 12% of the forest floor was covered in fruiting shrubs that are really important for pine martens in the autumn months. And there are various other categories of importance as well. Of course, woody debris is important because they use it for shelter and to hunt small mammals. We looked at the existence of rocky outcrops. We looked at all sorts of other features as well. But that gives you a flavor of why it's important not just to examine the forest from a desktop at home using maps and models. You need to get out and really study the micro habitat features of that forest as well. The last bit of field work that we did last year was small mammal trapping. This is Ellie, project officer and friend of mine who I work with. And the aim here was to quantify the prey base for a reintroduced marten population. We've already mentioned the importance of small mammals. They're particularly fond of field voles, but they will take wood mice and bank voles as well if they're abundant and available. So in this case, we worked in September and October, which compares with similar studies that were done in the Forest of Dean. And we used live Longworth traps, and we deployed them across 16 different sites across a very large area. And at each of those sites, there was a network of 25 individual traps set up in a sort of grid fashion. And basically we went out and we baited the traps in the evening, left them overnight and checked them in the morning. And any captures were recorded in terms of species, weight, and sex. I was going to say age, but no, sex. So that's the data that we got from the mammal traps. And these are some of our results. So you can see that, again, across the same strata, the same different habitats, the same 4 habitats, at all of those habitats, wood mice were most abundant. And in fact, of the 129 captures, 80% of the total were wood mice, with smaller numbers of bank voles and field voles. And we took measures to avoid the capture of shrews because they die very successfully, very quickly in traps. And then we wanted to compare to get some measure of, those are just figures. How does that compare with other studies where martens have been reintroduced and doing well? So again, we compared our results with those from the Forest of Dean. And there are plenty of small mammals to sustain pine martens in Cumbria. There's no doubt about that. If you look at all species at the bottom, our results in terms of an index of abundance, our results are 4.5 times as high as they were in the Forest of Dean. And what we've actually looked at here, without going into too many technicalities, is the average number of captures per 100 trap nights. And a trap night is just a trap being out in the woods, one trap being out in the woods for one night. And what's so remarkable about this is that these results, our results, were clearly skewed by this huge abundance of wood mice. And I suspect that's partly to do with the fact that we were surveying at the end of the season, at the end of the breeding season, although that was the same time as they surveyed in the Forest of Dean. I think it probably had more to do with the fact that 2020 was an extremely good mast year. And so there was a huge explosion of wood mice in 2020, probably reduced the mortality over winter, and that sort of had knock-on effects in terms of our results in 2021. And lastly, but not by any means least important, in fact, community engagement, I would argue, is as important as any of the ecological work that we did. But I'll just talk to you a little bit about the community engagement work before we finish. And yeah, we've done all manner of different, we've used all manner of different methods to engage the communities in the project area, and in fact, not just local communities, but regional communities as well. A little bit of radio and television work, Zoom meetings, a few parish hall face-to-face meetings. They were difficult during COVID, but I want to speak to you about I want to give you some results that relate to the door-to-door work that we did, because I think that was most revealing, and I think that those data are probably most important. So why do we do this? Well, we got to remember that martens were rendered extinct across large areas of the UK at the hands of man. So unless you address that human dynamic, there's a very high risk that even if all your ecological parameters are right, the martens that you're going to reintroduce or reinforce are still not going to thrive. So it's about building relationships with the rural communities. It's about giving them, it's about presenting them with objective information about the species. It's about receiving stories and records from them. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is quantify the level of support or objection within the community that you're working in. And that boils down to risk. Because if you haven't established those relationships and you haven't engaged the community correctly, and you haven't identified those hardcore farmers, for example, who are still using strychnine in the landscape, then again, you're about to embark on a complex, costly reintroduction project that is probably doomed from the outset. So it is important to engage with local communities. So we did a lot of work, a lot of door-to-door work with the general public in South Uthwaite and Finsthwaite and all of these small villages that we're working with, and most of that was door-to-door with the general public, and those results were very positive. Most of the people were very supportive of what we're doing, but actually I'm not going to dwell on those, because having worked on previous reintroduction projects, you know, there's this, it's fairly, those results I think from the general public are fairly predictable. Most people have an awareness of conservation, and most people in rural areas enjoy wildlife and want to see native wildlife restored. And so you would expect support from the general public. The reason you don't get too many objections is usually to do with the fact that actually most of those people are not most of those people are not disadvantaged in any way by the reintroduction of a species. So what I'd like to talk to you more about is some work that we did with the farmers and the landowners. We delivered a questionnaire door-to-door in the Roslin and Grisdale area. There are 36 farms in our patch that we mapped and visited, and they were a fantastic bunch of people, I have to say. I've spent many years working with farmers as a vet, and you know, they do get bad press, and inevitably there are some bad individuals out there, as there are in every sector of society. But 96% of the farms engaged with the process, 75% of them completed questionnaires. And I've said there that only 6 farms or private estates have high-risk livestock. And what I mean by that is that, you know, I think part of the reason why so many farmers were happy to chat and engage was because actually they want to see native species restored, but they also realize that pine marten is fairly benign. If you have free-range poultry, or if you put pheasant poults out and you're shooting, then there are risks that need to be mitigated from pine martens. But actually, you know, the majority of farmers in the area we work in have beef cattle and sheep, and recognize that they're not going to be impacted by a small mustelid reintroduction. So the themes that we looked at in the questionnaire included some of the following. We looked at the extent to which people wanted to see the recovery of pine martens in South Cumbria, whether in fact they wanted reintroduction to be used as a method, or whether they wanted nature to take its course and natural recolonization. We looked at issues around control of pine martens, because a lot of farmers are in the habit of controlling species, rooks, jackdaws, rabbits, rats, whatever they happen to be. And so some of them have a sort of general, some of them will sort of extrapolate to any species in the landscape and will tell you that, yes, they're happy for you to work on pine marten and to reintroduce them, as long as they can control the species if numbers become excessive. We looked at impacts on native species. That's really important. What about those priority bird species? What about the bats? What about the hazel dormouse? What are the impacts, positive or negative, going to be if you reintroduce a small predator like a pine marten? And then impacts on business, livelihoods, and use of legal pest control. A couple of slides and I've finished. These were some of the results, which I thought were quite striking, really. So within the community of farmers and landowners, 69% agreed that they would like to see the recovery of pine martens in their area. And of those, 56% suggested that reintroduction should be used as a method to recover martens. Inevitably, a number of them were sitting on the fence and undecided, and a relatively small proportion disagreed or strongly disagreed. So I think that bodes well. And we can identify those individuals, and we can engage them more fully, more comprehensively as time goes on. The other interesting result from the questionnaire study was looking at pest control methods. Why is this important? Well, it goes all the way back to that those IUCN reintroduction guidelines. Have you overcome the cause of previous extinction? They were shot, they were hunted for fur, they were hunted for sport, they were trapped, they were poisoned historically. Is any of that still going on? So we asked the farmers and the landowners. 47% of them shoot vermin, rats, crows, different species, and that was expected. I didn't expect any less than that. They're not easy to kill with a shotgun, pine martens. They're much more straightforward to poison and kill in tunnel traps. Tunnel traps are these spring traps that sit within tubes. They're still legal to trap things like weasels and stoats and rats. But you need, if you're going to use them in a legal fashion, you need to put excluders. So these are little gadgets that go in the end of the traps that exclude non-target species like protected pine martens or hedgehogs. 14% use tunnel traps, and I can tell you they use them all on a temporary basis, and allegedly they were using excluders. Second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, these super powerful rat baits that we have available to us these days. Again, I imagine that a high percentage of farmers would be using them, but it's how you use them. And the good news really was that the majority of them were using them inside the sheds, inside the steadings, which pine martens would not normally frequent, and they were being used on a temporary basis in response to an explosion of rats, for example, at harvest time, rather than on an ongoing basis. So those were some of the results from the community engagement work we did with the landowners and the farmers. And just before I finish, I'll say that there's a bunch of work that remains in progress. So I'm just completing ecological risk assessments. We've got traffic cameras. We've got camera traps looking at traffic volume. We haven't finished that work and analyzed that data yet. I mentioned, I think I touched upon the scoring system. We've got some great students involved in this trip as well. So there's lots of ongoing, there's not lots of ongoing work. We've done most of it, but there is still some work that needs to be finalized and incorporated into the feasibility report. So next steps. Well, the next step we hope is a giant mutant ninja pine marten in the forest down the road from where you live. No, I jest, but I put this final picture of a Caledonian pine forest in, and my 14-year-old lad came to me and said, "Dad, what you need to do is add a little pine marten face." And so we've done that. And doesn't it look great? Doesn't it enhance that landscape to have a pine marten within it? Not that I'm biased or anything. Thank you. So just before I finish, I just wanted to, I mentioned at the beginning that Boom is a partnership project. On the pine marten side, I'd like to just thank our colleagues at the Vincent Wildlife Trust, who have been fantastic, the Rosalind Horizon Trust, the gentleman from the Rosalind Horizon Trust, and Forestry England, who we work with very closely. So great, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mick. That was great, thank you. We've got quite a few questions that have already come in on the chat. I'll start with a couple which came in about food. I guess different people maybe with concerns who have interest in sort of other areas. The first thing was you mentioned about that they particularly love beetles. Would they eat butterflies, pupae, caterpillars? Is there any evidence from any of the scats or about that side of their diet?
I think it's very hard because they're all soft-bodied invertebrates. It would be very hard to identify pupae and caterpillar remains from a scat, but it's well known that they consume a kind of range of invertebrates, typically in season during the summer months, and they seem to have this thing for beetles, ground beetles, dung beetles, that type of thing. But entirely possible that they could, if they found moth or caterpillar larvae, that they could consume them. But I suspect as a very small component of their diet compared to songbirds, for example, or hedgehogs, other species.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And this next one, which I imagine might have been one of your frequently asked questions on the doorstep when you were doing your face-to-face. Is there any evidence of them taking young lambs or deer fawns? Are they too small?
No, there's no evidence at all, and they're just not big enough and strong enough. They're only the size of a small cat. There is sort of sexual dimorphism in martens, so that the adults are larger the males are larger than the females, but you're still only talking about an animal that weighs between 1 kilo and 2 kilos in weight. So they have found, we had 3 or 4 farmers ask us the same question, and they have found wool in pine marten scats, but it's almost certainly scavenged from stillborn lambs or dead lambs on the fell, that type of thing. And there's no evidence at all of live predation of lambs or calves or fawns. No.
So when you were talking about sort of sensitive livestock or livestock where people would have concerns, was that mainly things like chickens, pheasants?
Yeah, it is, Tom. It's game birds and free range pheasants, really.
Yeah.
So game birds, I mean, Vincent Wildlife have done a lot of good work around game birds, and we're working with 2 or 3 large private estates in Rosalind that are very, very supportive of what we're doing and very keen on martens. And they're very pragmatic about it and just sort of simply say, look, we put down 15,000 birds a year. They're never all shot. There's always a surplus at the end of the season that gets predated by foxes, badgers, buzzards, whatever through the winter. So if a marten takes 1 or 2, that's okay. But that's only one, that's only the opinion of 1 or 2 landowners who are more supportive. The fact is, if martens get into pheasant release pens in late summer, early autumn, they can kill pheasant poults. So in areas where martens exist with commercial pheasant shooting interests, they use things like line wire electric fencing at the top of the enclosure to keep the martens out. You're going to make sure that these little pop holes, as they call them, the little holes at the bottom of the fences that allow the pheasant poults to come and go through the day, you need to make sure you close them up at night. And so, yeah, so, you know, there are 3 or 4 reasonably low cost, fairly straightforward mitigation measures you can apply to avoid losing pheasants and red-legged partridge and so on to pine martens.
Yeah, great, thank you. Next, this is an interesting question. We had quite a lot of trees, particularly large trees, that were blown down in Storm Arwen back before Christmas. Certainly, you know, areas around Carmel Peninsula and things, because of those weird wind directions coming from the north, and you get these very shallow roots, particularly on the limestone, and it all just went woomph. Is there any evidence that any of that could impact the project? I guess particularly bearing in mind your comments around the lack of denning sites that we have already.
Yeah, I think it's all, well, dare I say it, I think it's all good news. I mean, I went through Rusland the week after Storm Arwen, and it was utter devastation, and your heart sinks and you think, gosh, there's even Caledonia, there's even Scots pine and oak that are hundreds of years old that have come down here. But I suppose it depends hugely on what the foresters do with those fallen trees, because fallen dead wood is a fantastic habitat for beetles and beetle larvae. It's also fantastic shelter and habitat for small mammals, and it will provide shelter and denning opportunities for martens as well. So I think ultimately, if the project goes ahead, we're going to have to put boxes up in the landscape anyway. And I think that kind of messiness, that kind of structural diversity on the forest floor is probably going to be good for all sorts of species. And I think the risk is that, you know, on some farms and private estates and areas of forest, you know, if people are too risk averse and so on, then every last tree is going to be sawed up and taken away. And that's a kind of missed opportunity for wildlife, and I think probably including the martens to some extent. But it's a difficult one to answer, Tom, to be honest. Yeah,
so this kind of swings and roundabouts, but on the whole, kind of the impact on food will probably outweigh the negative impacts of the dens.
I mean, the other thing that just comes to mind, of course, is that they, you know, where there are gaps in the canopy, that allows grass cover to establish, and again, that's great for small mammals. So these woodland glades and rides and gaps probably present feeding opportunities for them, I would think, in the longer term.
Yeah, great. This is a slightly more kind of philosophical question, I suppose, about sort of conservation priorities. So there's a question here, which is whether it might be better in terms of time and money to focus on improving habitat to the south of the North Cumbrian population, sort of filling in all that white space on your map, rather than focusing on reintroducing or reinforcing a separate population.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly valid, and the Vincent Wildlife Trust are, well, I don't know how much I can say actually. But anyway, they're in the early stages of a project called Martens on the Move, which is all about monitoring the dispersal and movement of those martens that are recolonizing in Kielder. And I talked with them recently, and we mentioned, you know, you can map quite accurately the routes that these martens are likely to take. And wouldn't it be good if there was habitat creation work along those dispersal corridors to hasten the recolonization of some of the larger woodlands in the south of the county? And I think, you know, wouldn't it be good to do a translocation in conjunction with that habitat creation work? And the reason I suppose the reason I think that is because marten populations need to be restored south of the county, not just for their own sake, but because because they have other useful benefits. We talked about red squirrels, but they disperse seeds, they have all sorts of other functions within the ecosystem. So I see a place for both.
Yeah,
is probably my best answer at this point.
I was lucky enough actually to see some of the data from the Forest of Dean reintroduction.
Yeah.
And I know that in the modelling there, where they sort of modelled the impact of the Forest of Dean population actually on the Central Welsh population, and all the evidence was that where you have two populations that become sustainable, when they eventually meet, you can get actually a big explosion of pine marten, which was really, really interesting. And I guess a similar thing might happen here as well, which is if you end up with a resilient South Cumbria and West Cumbrian population, and you've got them spreading out of a Kielder stronghold as well, overall, both populations end up stronger, don't they, as a result of having them both?
And I think the other thing to mention there is that, some translocation projects cost millions, but there's no reason for a pine marten translocation project to cost vast amounts of money, because most of the feasibility work will have been done through the Boom project, and reinforcing or reintroducing martens over the next 2 or 3 years is going to be, if it goes ahead, will be complex and costly, but not to the extent of some of the other species that are being worked on at the moment.
That was the next question, actually. Do you have any idea? I mean, even if it's just a sort of order of magnitude cost for what a reintroduction of or translocation of, say, 40 pine martens and plus denning boxes would cost?
We've talked about this and looked at this, and essentially with this project, because we're finishing the feasibility work, we're now beginning to talk. Well, we'll finish the feasibility report and circulate it, and then key stakeholder groups can evaluate the evidence and decide whether we move forward towards implementation, towards a translocation. But we have had some discussions around the partnership that might develop to take things forward, around where the funding might come from, around suitable release sites in Rusland, because all of these important factors need to come together as part of project development in the next stage. I think it might cost somewhere ballpark of 100,000 per annum for 2 or 3 years to reintroduce martens in South Cumbria, but that's a very rough guesstimate.
Yeah. No, it's useful to have, isn't it?
I think the tricky thing about habitat creation, I mean, the government has all sorts of targets to expand for forest creation schemes around the country, and forest creation will be written into the elm schemes and so on. So there are all sorts of targets and plans. But the tricky thing is when you look at what we call the least cost path, when you look at the likely dispersal routes of martens between those two populations, and you really drill down on it on Google Maps, you begin to recognize that they're going to go through land that probably belongs to 20 or 30 private farmers and another 10 or 20 private estates. And so it's ambitious and it should be done, but it's a long-term project, because you're not dealing with a great big chunk. You're not dealing with a single landowner and a single set of consents and procedures and so on. So
okay, thank you. So we've still got quite a few more questions. We might go a little bit over 8:30, but I think we'll be okay. So the next one is around whether your modelling of future populations, particularly obviously because you're going 50 years or even 200 years ahead of now with your modelling, are you factoring in climate change at all to those models, and does climate change have
that's a really interesting question, and no, we're not, but yes, you can. I'm no modeling expert, Tom, but you can indeed include climate data into some of these modeling software. The reason we're not doing it is because martens, if you look at the geographic range of martens, you find them all the way from the boreal in places like Russia and northern Finland to the islands of Minorca in the Med. So actually they occupy a really broad climate envelope or climatic range. So even if it gets wetter in the winters and warmer in the summers, for example, it's likely that because of their habits, because they're generalist predators, and they can change their feeding habits from plant to animal, and from even within animals, from small mammals to birds and carrion and so forth. It's likely that they will adapt to climatic changes as time goes by.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, isn't it? When they've got that broad niche, as opposed to, I don't know, if you're a mountain hare or something, it's a little bit different, isn't it?
Exactly, or a ptarmigan or a hazel dormouse in Cumbria or whatever.
Yeah.
If you're at the northern or southern edge of your range, but they're very widespread.
So I mean, it's astonishing just though how widespread they are in Ireland now. I had no idea, that's a massive success story, isn't it? Incredible.
It's a huge success story. Martens and red squirrels are in every county in the Irish Republic now. And from conversations with Emma Sheehy, there is almost no active grey squirrel control going on. And the grey squirrels will continue to thrive in some of the urban areas that the pine martens don't get to, and this sort of thing. So there will be these kind of grey squirrel refugia, if you like. But it's fantastic. But the thing is, you've got to be a little bit careful about how you frame arguments regarding martens and squirrels, because all of those effects are density dependent. So you need to acknowledge the fact that all of the good work that the 15 or 16 red squirrel groups are doing in Cumbria needs to go on, actually, because if you reintroduce martens to South Cumbria, it will be 10 or 20 years probably, at a guess, before the distribution of the density of those animals is sufficient to have similar impacts on the grey squirrels that they've seen in Ireland. So trapping and sterilization and all these measures that are going on with the red squirrel groups, I think, are still important.
That's really, really helpful. It was kind of our next question, really, which was around the relationship between the red squirrel projects, or the grey squirrel control and the marten. So I think you've just answered that really well in terms of the time lag, really, before we'll see a positive impact from any pine martens. Although I'm imagining that you're getting support, are you, from the Westmoreland squirrel group?
We're in touch with them, and we share the red squirrel data from Russell and Grisdale with them. Although, and I haven't reached out to all of them because it's a big complex network. But the group that works in the area, in the project area, we've had good contact with over the last couple of years.
So final questions now, which are kind of linked, really. So you mentioned other mustelid species, and in particular, you said that there was an overlap with polecats in terms of the sort of the niche that they occupy. So do you have any evidence for what the impact of pine martens would be on other mustelid species? And then kind of secondly, whether there's any relationship with mink in the same way that I know there is with otters, where they can drive out mink.
I don't think there's mink are a problem, and they exist. We've seen them in the project area, and I don't think there's any evidence that pine marten displaced mink, because mink use sort of riparian habitats, waterways, and this sort of thing. And they're at least, actually, I'm not sure, but I would think they're at least the size of, or similar size to a pine marten. With regards to polecats, again, there is no evidence that expanding pine marten populations either predate upon or displace polecats. Polecats coexist with martens across huge areas of mainland Europe, and again, because they've co-evolved in the landscape, they will have ways of coexisting. There is, having said, there's niche overlap. So in other words, they will occupy the same woodland habitats and areas. Actually, polecats, there is also niche separation. So polecats are strictly nocturnal for a start, whereas pine marten are also nocturnal, but certainly when they've got kits in the den, they hunt during the day, they hunt at twilight. as well. And polecats are more predatory, more carnivorous, so they tend to specialize on things like rabbits. So there's less overlap in terms of invertebrates and some of the plant material that pine martens consume. But again, I haven't read exhaustively, but what I have read suggests that these two species can coexist just fine. I think the issue with polecats is whether they get killed on the roads. We found 2 dead on the roads in 3 years, and whether there's any level of ongoing persecution to constrain their populations.
Great. Well, thank you. That's it. You're off the hook. Sorry, it felt like a grilling.
Feels like a Friday night.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So, presumably, Mick, are there ways of getting in touch with you if anybody wanted to find out more or get involved? Yeah,
of course. I'm happy to give out my uni email, and if there are any questions or if anyone's interested in volunteering, there's less volunteering work now, but we're still going out and doing some survey work. And very happy to receive questions or comments or whatever.
Well, thank you. So I guess there's obviously via the University of Cumbria, or if you wanted to come via Anya and Morecambe Bay Partnership, then we can certainly pass things on as well. But no, that's absolutely fantastic. You can see from how long everyone stayed on to let you listen and also listen to all the answers to the questions too. So thank you very much. If you get a chance, look at the chat, because there's loads of really, really nice comments
thanks.
coming
I
through.
enjoyed it.
Thank
it was
you.
a privilege speaking to you all. So thank you.